Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Queens Public Library's Literary Thursdays. My name is Karen Vermouth, Coordinator of Adult Services. QPL is open for to-go service, so you can pick up and return materials at many locations. Select QPL locations are entering stage 2 of our reopening plan, offering browsing, computer use, and in-person reference services that started on May 10th. To learn more about Stage 2, see our virtual program calendar, access digital services, or get an e-card, visit queenslibrary.org. This year, QPL is celebrating its 125th anniversary. Visit QPL125.org to get involved by taking our library personality test, participating in our Urban Archives project, and more. QPL is proud to have served the people of Queens since 1896, providing customers with the resources they need to advance in their lives. Libraries offer tools, resources, and places to grow. What does the library mean to you? Share your library experience at notes.librariesmakenycstronger.org. Nancy Pine has traveled and studied in China for decades. She holds a PhD in education and is one of the leading American experts on Chinese early childhood education, which led to her book, Educating Young Giants. She has taught everything from kindergarten to graduate school and founded the Bridging Cultures U.S.-China program. At Mount St. Mary's University, she is a professor emerita and, among other things, has advised the administration and faculty on China. She gives talks nationally and internationally and has won numerous awards, including a City of Los Angeles honor for her cross-cultural activities. Welcome, Nancy, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Karen, and it's good to be here. And this talk is not about the education book, but about One in a Billion, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey Through Modern Day China, which is a book that I was just published and which I wasn't even planning to write, but over a period of a decade or so, it evolved. So here goes, and I look forward to plenty of questions at the end. And okay, here we go. So the preview, what I'm going to cover today is my China beginnings, how I met An Wei, writing the book, and more About An Wei, who is the person, of course, the book is about. And so just a little geography, and up there in Beijing, if my cursor works there, Beijing is the capital of China and a huge city. And then if you go down the coast to Shanghai, that's another huge city. And they are culturally very diverse and have different dialects and have been cultural competitors for a long time. If you go west from Shanghai to Nanjing, that is my Chinese home, Nanjing University. Every trip I make, I in fact end up going, spending a fair number of days in Nanjing, and I've done a lot of collaboration with the faculty there at Nanjing University and some of the students. And then if you go farther west to Xi'an, that is where the large terracotta army was found, actually when An Wei was an adult, a young adult. And it was the beginning of the Silk Road, and has many, many historical sites in the city that a lot of people like to go visit. And then if you go west just a little way from Xi'an to underneath the X in Xi'an, that's where Anshang village is, which is Anwei's home village, and where I've spent about 10 or 11 weeks. So my beginnings in China. I spent 10 years going to China before I met Anwei. First as a mid-career graduate student, I and another mid-career graduate student boarded this plane after Christmas on December 1989. We went to meet our advisor, our faculty advisor, who was in China at Nanjing University, and we were going to join him. He had been an advisor for the university. 1989 obviously was a very tense time at the end because it was right after Tiananmen Square, which happened in June. And our advisor had been there on sabbatical at the time, had had to leave. But then in the fall, his colleagues in Nanjing asked if he was willing to come back and if he could bring 2 graduate students. So I went there as long as the other graduate student. We spent 3 weeks in Nanjing. The first week sort of learning how the culture worked a little bit, and also meeting some wonderful colleagues. And then the last 2 weeks we spent collecting preliminary data from preschools and first graders for our dissertations about young children's learning. So 2 years later, I went back by myself and collected data from 2 and 3 year old children, which is a challenge, but also fun. And I was collecting what's called pre-writing, or scribble, we might call it. If you ask a 2-year-old to write something, they are likely to do something very serious, as this child is doing, but in fact, it's nothing you or I could read. However, if you ask children in China to do it, they produce something very different from what people in the United States or in other countries would do with other language bases. The man in the right is my Chinese colleague in the city where I collected some of the data. I traveled to various cities during that trip, and he was overseeing the whole situation. The woman is one of the children's teachers, and I do not speak Chinese, and so that's I've never had time to really spend the concentrated time it takes. I've learned little bits and pieces, and so I can have small conversations, but nothing related to serious work. And even if I did speak Chinese, I would still need to work with a Chinese colleague because, in fact, I'm very strange looking in China. And I was especially then because there were very few foreigners there. The picture in the top left is Nanjing University, which when we first went. And of course, now those bicycles have been replaced by a lot of motor scooters and cars. Later on, after I did my dissertation, I went back to study how teaching was done in the schools. This is a first grade class in a Chinese lesson. And I went to hundreds of schools over the time. And I did the same thing. Whatever I was doing in China, I was also doing in the United States. And so that's how I ended up writing a book about Chinese and American education. I became a professor of education, returning to China once or twice a year to do research about young children's learning and also consulting. But while I was doing that and doing research, I began to collect stories from a few Chinese who were of a lot of interest to me. They had been born before 1949, which was when the People's Republic of China was founded. And so their lives mirrored, they had lived through all of the ups and downs of China's development, all of the accomplishments and all of the disasters. And they were also people who were innovative and who weren't afraid to push back on things. So the first person who inspired me to think about collecting these stories was one of my early research persons, who was Huang Rensong, who's in the picture there at the bottom, She was about 75 when I met her and began doing research with her. She was a tough person to work with. She was very demanding. And of course, she had a different research style than I had. And so we had lots of very long discussions and long lunches and meals. But in fact, we ended up doing some very interesting research together. And she was a preschool teacher who had pushed back a lot, who was innovative, and she was obviously gotten a fair amount of trouble in the process of doing that. And then I met a few other people who were in the same category, who had that same pattern of history. After 10 years, a friend wrote me and said, I have met a man you have got to meet. His name is An Wei, and he is doing the same kinds of things that you are doing. And he said, you are both trying to work with Americans and Chinese citizens to help them communicate with each other better on just a day-to-day basis, nothing to do with politics and government, but just how did they live? What were their dreams? Various things of that kind. And so he and I, An Wei and I finally met. He lived in the middle of China and I lived in the United States, so it took a while. But once we met, we really had two main interests. I didn't know his life history at all. We're working on the American-Chinese connection and how we could help citizens just get to know each other better. What kind of situations would do that? The other thing was that he was from the rural area, and I was from the rural area of the United States. In fact, I grew up in the woods of northern New Jersey. And so I had always been very interested in rural areas in whatever country. And so having spent 10 years in China, I really longed to get to know some of the rural areas, but it's very hard for a foreigner to spend any quality time in a village. But An Wei had encouraged an American organization called Global Volunteers to actually have a program in China to help university and high school students learn English better, oral English better. Because An Wei knew that as China opened up, they needed to actually have a better grip of another language, because presumably most people in the world were not going to learn Chinese. So that organization had come to China, and one thing they wanted to do was to start some of this language development in rural areas for high school teachers who taught English but had never heard a native speaker and were afraid to speak to their students at all. And so they set up a program at An Wei's village, which was Anshang Village. And this is the entrance road to Anshang Village. It's a small, poor village in the middle of China. And the soil is made of loess, which is blown down from the northern steppes over the millennia. And it is about the stickiest stuff I have ever come across when it's wet. Down below is a picture of the entrance of Anshang Village, and many foreigners look at those houses and say, that is not a poor village. And it certainly does not look like one with those tiled houses. But in fact, most of the houses in Anshang are made of brick or other materials, and they're all much better than they were, say, 30 years ago. But if you go inside one of these houses that looks very fancy on the outside, in fact, a lot of it is just full of seed bags and farm tools, and sometimes a motorcycle or a farm cart or something. And then there's a section of the house which is devoted to living. So it's not as sort of suburban as you might think at all. And the toilets are not Western toilets, they're pit toilets. So some villagers lived in caves like these until the 1980s. In fact, these are some of the caves they lived in. They're dug into the loess when it's actually very solid, like it is in this picture. And this area of China still has a number of people and villages who are living in caves because it's cheap and because actually a lot of people say they prefer them because they're cool in the summertime and for other reasons. So I joined the program in 2004. I stayed in Anshang village for 3 weeks. I lived in, there were three of us who were volunteers, and we and the teachers lived with villagers. And while we were teaching and working with the high school English teachers, the villagers were working day and night to bring in the corn crop. It was October, and they had to bring it in and it had dried partially on the stalks, and then they took the husks off the stalks. And I watched the family I lived with husk those stalks, husk those cobs uh, until midnight. So they were getting up at dawn and they were working well into the night, every night throughout the village, because they were pushing very hard to get this corn dry so they could create meal from it and also turn it into good feed for animals. But then they had to plow the fields and plant the next crop before the weather changed. So they were pushing very, very hard. And as a result, we didn't get to meet very many people. Anwei was actually in the village at that time, and I began to realize that his life probably was similar to those few people's I collected, of being born before 1949, being innovative, and definitely being someone who pushed back against things. So because I became very interested in the rural pattern of living and it being controlled by the seasons, I returned in 2006 in the spring when the winter wheat was almost ripe. And the village was much more relaxed because they're waiting for that crop, which is pictured a little bit in the bottom picture, to ripen so they could harvest it. And so Anwei was persuaded by one of the volunteers to talk to us about his history of growing up in the village, which had been 50 years ago or so. And so the picture on the right is Anwei during that talk. And in the middle of it, someone interrupted him and said, "Would you please," in fact, they said, someone's got to do a PhD on this, on your life, because it's very important. And in fact, it's going to get lost, this information. And that gave me my chance. And I jumped in and I said, not quite sure what I was turning myself into or what I was going to get into. I said, I'm not going to do another PhD, but I certainly could write an article. And that was of interest to Anwei. And so I ended up, we agreed that I would meet with him when I returned at the end of the year. And I would add a couple of days to the trip to China in order to interview him. And so during that interview of 3 days, Anwei talked nonstop for 3 days about the history of China, about his history and how to interwove with that history. And I realized by the end of 3 days, it was more than an article. I really didn't want to deal with the fact that it might be a book, but in fact, that's of course what it eventually became. So a little more about the village. On the left are the women relaxing at the end of the day while they're waiting for the crops to ripen. They come out about 4 o'clock or so with their knitting and embroidery and their grandchildren and just enjoy each other for a while. The large picture the picture with the large crowd are villagers, not just from Anshang, but from other surrounding villages, coming to hear the opera company, which belonged to the county, and had come to Anshang for a couple of days to perform. And opera in the rural area is the soul of rural China. There were many Anshang villagers who sang opera, and it was very soulful and just it sort of communicated what life must be like for being a rural farmer or peasant. At the bottom right is a little bit of the village center that's about 3 times that size, that fronts on the road that runs through Anzhong. And that road is about a city block long. So Anzhong really is quite small, and it really is also quite poor. So I began to interview An Wei in 2006. My last interview was 2016. And during those 10 years, I collected a gigabyte or more, many gigabytes probably, of interviews. And every time I went to China to do research and consulting, I also, because I did have a full-time job, I added on a few days to go there and to Xi'an and interview him. And he was pretty enthusiastic. I mean, he was very willing to do this. And he talked about the big picture. He talked about foreign policy, about national policy, about the structure of the Communist Party, about protocol in the office, and all sorts of things like that. Those were very important for me to learn, and I did a lot of digging for research papers and books so that I could learn a lot that I didn't know. But I also wanted details, and it's like, what did they eat? And what did they wear? And what were the school desks like? And so I finally realized the thing to do to get him to talk about details was to photocopy old National Geographics I had of their costume, their clothes, and their tools, and animals, and village buildings, and show them to him and say, is this what it was like? And very often he'd say, no, it wasn't quite like that. But then he'd see a pitchfork and say, oh, that's like the pitchforks we used to use, except there was a little difference. And so I showed him, for instance, this picture of clothing and said, so is this like what you wore? This is from the 1940s in the National Geographic. And he said, yes, exactly. And he said, that was like what we wore in the warm months. And then we had another set of clothes in the winter months. And he said, we only had 2 sets of clothes. We put them on at the beginning of 6 months and took them off at the end of 6 months. And he said, obviously, they were very dirty. We probably really smelled terrible. And he said, I can guarantee you that they were full of lice. But we were warm and we didn't have rags. So in fact, we were happy for that. I also showed him plenty of others, and so he began to get really involved. So when he saw a picture of a plow that was similar to what they had used in Anshang, he said, ah, okay. He said, that's sort of like what we used. And he got up and started stomping around the room where I was interviewing him, showing me how he learned how to plow and how difficult it is to keep the head of the plow under the soil as an animal is moving forward. So he really began to get the idea of what I needed besides the big picture, and was much more willing at that point to help me out. Toward the end of interviewing him, the last few years, I realized I really needed to go visit places important to An Wei's life. And so I mentioned to him while I was in Xi'an that I was going to go visit the university he had attended. And he said, oh, don't go by yourself. Let my wife and me go and show you. And so we spent some wonderful afternoons going to the university where they both attended and were both English majors, and to a museum he had started for a woman he had worked on her life for a very long time, whose name is Helen Foster Snow, who was the first wife of Edgar Snow, who wrote the Red Star over China. And but she never got any credit for all the work she did on all those projects. And so there were people who were really interested in getting her reputation started. So he had started a museum, and then we went to some other places in Xi'an. And then I knew I had to go to Yan'an, which is in the north, where the long march of the Communist Party ended, and where the communists spent about 10 years there, uh, sort of developing their theories and also building their power so that they could try to overtake China. And so, and An Wei spent 6 or 7 years of the Cultural Revolution there, separated from his family. He, 2 of those years in a re-education camp, and the rest in Yan'an itself, working on for a foreign affairs institute. And so we went there. He knew the vice president who had been trying to get him to come talk. And so we went there. She said, if the 2 of you come and give about 6 or so lectures on culture, on writing, on various things for our students, then the university can loan you a car and driver, and you can go around and visit all these places. So we spent about a week doing that, working very hard, but also spending a lot of time in all of the various places that An Wei had spent time there. We also went to several places important to An Wei's life. And the one at the bottom is in Farmer Wang's village. An Wei had became an interpreter for world leaders, and Jimmy Carter, whom he interpreted for, were visited this village of Mr. Wang's. And that's Farmer Wang on the left talking to me about the visit of Jimmy Carter, and on the right, An Wei interpreting. And the village really enjoyed the idea of reliving part of the visit, and so of Jimmy Carter. So the food you see is actually the same dishes that they served to Jimmy Carter and his family when they visited. I also began to stay with An Wei and his wife in their condominium. And that's a little tricky for an interviewer to do because you don't want to get too close to the subject to whom you're writing about. But in fact, I didn't need to worry because An Wei was very organized. And when I arrived, he would actually hand me a printout of my schedule for the few days I was there. What hours we were going to do interviews, when I had time off and could go for a walk or something, when I was going to give a lecture at a university that I didn't know I was going to give a lecture at, and then maybe dinners with various people he wanted me to meet. And so there was no, he was very organized. There was no need that I worry that we would become I would get too involved in the family. And then he and his wife both came with me when I went to Anshan village to do school research. So I had spent 3 different times with global volunteers, 3 weeks each in the village. And then I had gone back because I was doing research on rural schools with a Chinese colleague. And Anshan school became of great interest. And during those stays in the village, I took long walks with his wife, who told me all sorts of stories about his childhood, especially. So, but I also needed to learn to write narrative. I had been writing academic papers, which are very tight, which are data-driven and theory-driven, and they are not made for the general public. And I wanted this book, actually, which obviously had become the one story I was going to tell about someone whose life spanned that of modern China's development. I needed to learn to write good narrative. And so I started by going to the UCLA writing program, and I took a couple of courses in nonfiction writing, and then one in essay writing, and then some more in nonfiction writing. And then finally, I actually ended up taking one in novel writing, because although I was not writing a novel, I needed to learn how to bring a character to life. So those were very helpful. I also had plenty of friends who were reading chapters and commenting, and then I'd go back and rewrite stuff. But toward the end, I realized I needed significant just zeroing in on what I needed to do. And so I applied for a fellowship at the Vermont Studio Workshop in Northern Vermont, which for me was perfect because it was actually, they accepted 90% visual artists of all kinds and 10% only of writers. And so I was able to, it was a very rich and creative environment. And I was able to have lots of conversations with people of all different types of art, doing all different types of arts. And so I got a lot of different views about how to approach this story. And also, you know, how to develop it. So how to begin it and develop it, and also how to end it, which is not easy to decide. It's very easy to go too far, to go too long in either an art project or in writing. And so I spent 3 weeks there talking and in that office, in that white building by the river. And I was able to, by the end of 3 weeks, I had created the arc of the story, which is like the spine of the story of the book. And then it was write. And of course, there are other things that writers have to do. They'll have to find an agent, and then the agent finds a publisher, and you go through draft after draft after draft. So I had one consultant who used to say, "That's great, but just trash the first 5 pages of what you wrote." And so you sort of learn to do that as a writer. Then turning to An Wei's life, modern China, this is the quickest history you'll ever have of China. One PowerPoint slide. So the Communist Party formed China in 1949. They declared the People's Republic of China beginning in October 1949. The pictures below are from the September 1949 National Geographic of the communist troops coming into Beijing victorious over the nationalists, who were the nationalist government troops, who were overseen by Chiang Kai-shek. And they began a number of reforms right away, some of which were affected An Wei's life a lot. One of the things they did the first year, so by October 1950 or September 1950, they had instituted universal rural education. There was the school in Anchang took over the Buddhist temple, which was one room, and had one teacher and 4 grades. It was the first time there had ever been a school in Anchang village, and that was true of most of rural China until 1950. That actually changed An Wei's life completely, and has gradually changed the village's life. Another thing that affected the family was that there were 7 boys and 1 girl. She was the oldest of the siblings, and she had her feet bound. And so when the Communist Party made foot binding unlawful, the binding claws were taken off An Wei's sister's feet. And as an adult, she now has feet that are smaller than normal, but she can walk pretty naturally. And so she was, and it's hard to believe that even in the rural areas, the farm women had their feet bound and had even though they had to sometimes walk kilometers someplace, it was extremely painful and unpleasant for them and debilitating. So the other thing that the communist government did rather quickly was try to reform farming to get better production. And one of the first things they did was create cooperatives, which in fact the Anshang villagers and others in that area felt were very productive. It helped them organize how they were going to, how they would share their tools and their labor efforts and their animals and get more done more efficiently. And they did see their crops begin to improve. Then over time, the Communist Party began to move very quickly toward communes. And as it got more and more complicated over the next several years to, to share, the farmers actually saw their tools sort of taken away from them and their animals, and they were put into a common pool, so that they began to get very frustrated that they couldn't get the right animals at the right time or the right tools at the right time. And some of the people who ran a number of the communes were either corrupt or not very skilled at what they were doing. And so in the book, One in a Billion, there is at least one story but actually I think more, of trying to outwit some of those people in the communes who were in fact detrimental to the farmers' lives. So right now, Anhui is in his late 70s. He is not in great health, but he continues to work every day on this major project that he had started about Helen Foster Snow, Edgar Snow's first wife, because she had done an enormous amount of writing. When they came back to the United States and were divorced, she actually ended up living almost as a hermit in their house in northern Connecticut. And she just wrote continuously, and she had knowledge of all the important history of 1920s and 30s and early 40s in China. And it was very valuable, and is very valuable history to China, because there are very few people who recording this, and because it was such a chaotic period. And so he has worked very hard on it over many years, along with a few others who have also worked on it, and has worked to mentor young professors who would help translate her work into Chinese. And so that has now become part of a large university. And so he works with those young professors every day, is what I hear. During his childhood, growing up in that poor little village, he said they were hungry all the time, and his biggest fear was starving to death. And I think that was true of many of them, but they were all hungry. They never had enough to eat. But even after the new country was formed, it was just, they were still poor. Some things began to improve immensely, like school, but other things didn't. So his first year of school was the first year of the People's Republic of China, and it was just magnificent for him. It changed his life. He was the one child in the family who got to go to school, and the one who had been chosen originally didn't like it and quit. And so Anhui took his place. And their grandfather who ran the family, hated education. He thought it was a waste of time. And so although they were required to send their children to school, he only sent one person. And so Anhui studied 2 or 3 times harder than anyone else in the school. He would practice his characters in the air, writing them in the air, writing them in the dust, anywhere he could, and learning mathematical algorithms. And after the 4 years in that school, he went on to the next level, which was a 5th, 6th grade school in the nearby small town. And then he passed the exams to get into the county junior middle school, and then the exams to get into the high school. And the whole time he was very stubborn and hardworking. And I'm going to read you just a tiny bit from the book, which is to give you an idea of him. A shock of black hair framed his square face, and his eyes danced with mischief. And an aside from what's written in the book, that picture that you're seeing right now of An Wei is the most sad looking picture I've ever seen of him. It's at the end of his 6th grade year, and who knows what was going on. But in general, even in adulthood, his eyes danced with mischief and just alive. He loved to explore and play hard, but by age 4, he began taking on farm chores, as did other village kids. Though he worked willingly, he showed the fierce temper and stubborn nature that would accompany him throughout his life. As a toddler, he cried and rolled his way through temper tantrums, obeying no one. He stopped only when he exhausted himself. And so that's sort of a summary of An Wei's life as he grew up. The picture on the right is actually of his school. He found it on the Chinese internet, and it's not his class, but it is their cafeteria with a headmaster talking to them before they have a meal. As a young adult, he passed the grueling college entrance exam, which they didn't expect rural people to do. He majored in English, and he became a school leader and one of the top students in the college. That was great, and he had a great opportunity coming at the end of college. But the last week of college, the Cultural Revolution started, and that turned everything upside down. The next 2 years were the worst he has ever had, he said, and very dangerous because the Red Guard were after people like him who had been school leaders and very good students. They hated them. And so he just had to deal with the fact that he'd spent 18 years trying to live, trying to get out from under being a poor farmer. And that was all suddenly said to be terrible. And it was an enormous wrenching for a lot of people his age because they had grown up worshiping Chairman Mao, who said they were the future of the country and and they worked enormously hard to help change China and improve China on all the various projects that came along. But now it was all upside down. Education was useless, and they were told the only people who knew anything were the illiterate farmers. So he eventually, after a couple of years, he was able to get a job, it's still during the Cultural Revolution, at the Xi'an Foreign Languages Institute because they needed an English interpreter. And the only problem was they had no people coming to visit. So after a year, they really broke up the office and sent a lot of the people to farm camps who they never knew whether they were coming back. And they sent 3 young people to the Naniwan re-education school in the far north, which was it was brutal living. And the picture down below of the group walking is Naniwan about the time he was there. They were walking out in groups to do their jobs. He said he hated the working in those rice paddies because in fact they were it was so cold standing in that water all day long, bent over planting rice. The picture on the left is his wedding picture, and he got married during that time to someone who also went to school and majored in English, and they are in his room at the Foreign Affairs place. He managed to keep his English alive secretly. The picture on the left is Naniwan today, and he would climb those hills with an English volume he managed to figure out how to keep of Mao's work. And he would go, the hills go way beyond what you see there. And so he would go up into those hills and read it aloud and read it over and over again to try to keep his English. He had managed to keep that book by outwitting the commander-in-chief of the school, of the education school. And so he decided he had to be very careful because not everyone would be as easy to push over as the commander who was illiterate. Eventually, he became an English interpreter for foreign visitors. And as I said, he interpreted for people like Jimmy Carter. His first leader was the Prime Minister of England, and he interpreted for him when he was 32, and very nervous about it. The picture up on the upper right is him at an early age with Henry Kissinger, who he said was pretty difficult to interpret for because he had a German accent. He also, once China began to open, began traveling with Chinese officials who were going to various English-speaking countries, and he got to know a lot of people because of that. And he was just very congenial, and so he still is in touch with a number of those people. He also worked nights on other projects, on creating a translators association of the project that brought global volunteers to China. But colleagues were really jealous, and because he refused to bribe anyone, and he challenged corrupt officials a lot. And so he always had to sort of watch his back because they were after him in various ways. But when things didn't work out for him in his regular job, he always had all these other projects that he had started that he could work on. And he was always working very hard, also translating Helen Snow's materials. So probably the biggest project that he took on that was probably the most challenging to the local Chinese officials was he created a Democratic Congress in his village. And the picture on the left is Anhui starting the first Congress, and he looks a little nervous, and probably because he wasn't quite sure how this was all going to go. All the villagers had expressed enthusiasm for it. But he also had the night before been visited by the local Chinese officials in the next town who oversaw things in Anjiang village and told him he had to stop it. It was illegal, etc. He knew the laws. He knew it was not illegal. But in fact, the officials didn't like it because it was going to put the ruling in the villages in the hands of the villagers, and therefore the leaders would not be able to bribe the villagers continuously. So he fought off those those officials for a long time, and that Congress actually managed to continue for 7 years. And the picture on the right is villagers counting ballots because every Congress they had, they voted on various policies for the village. So that is the story, very briefly, of Anhui. It's laid out from the beginning of his life till the end in the book, and hopefully it's a good read. So I look forward to any questions you have, and so that's the end of my talk. You can find out more about Anhui at my website, nancypine.info. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Nancy. That was absolutely fascinating. We have a question really just for dates so we can understand about how old Anhui was. What year was he born?
Oh, having said that, he went to school when he was about 8. So he was born in the early 1940s. And I don't want to give you an exact date because I will be wrong, but it was about 1942 or 43. It was before the People's Republic of China was founded.
Okay. Do you know approximately how old he was when he got into college? How many years of schooling?
Oh, he was in his 20s, and I have all these. I haven't looked at these dates for a long time. He was older than many because he started first grade when he may have even been 8 when he started. So he was always older than we would think of being the normal age. So he went into college at about his 20s.
Okay. And then, So he was in his mid-20s when he was sent north. And
Yes,
it just surprises me because, yes, he went to college, but he was a peasant in the beginning. And he came from a farm family. He wasn't bourgeois,
right.
that he got caught up for re-education in the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly. Yeah, the whole thing is bizarre, I guess is the word, right? And infuriating to him, certainly. And puzzling because he just didn't understand how you could turn everything upside down. But that's what happened.
Okay, we have another question. Um, I think you said it was Anwei's grandfather who ran the family and thought
Yes,
education was a waste of time, not his father,
right.
right?
Yes, yes, that's
And
correct.
um, I guess the person is really questioning, asking why he would have thought that, because wouldn't more education bring in a better job and bring in some ready cash
I
to
think,
the family?
well, cash was a real problem in the villages and they had very little. They did a lot of bartering. But in fact, uh, the first thing is that the patriarch of the family, who was the grandfather, very often ruled that was the ruled it, and his grandfather they were afraid of. His parents were actually uh, pretty wonderful people, evidently, and but the grandfather controlled everything, and so and he was the kids used to try to go to other villages and stay overnight because their grandfather would curse and threaten to beat them. And I don't think he abused them too much physically, but he was excessively demanding. And he was just focused on trying to keep food coming in for this large family. And uh, he just he didn't know anything about education. He didn't know what it was. I think all he saw about education was it was going to take the children away from helping do the farm chores. And
Uh,
so that was, so there was no, I think one thing I've learned, and I love to have some Chinese correct me on this, but in fact, within the village structure, there was very little looking to the next generation. I mean, they learned skills about how to stay alive, about how to do all the things that was needed to stay alive and try to improve yourself a little bit. But in fact, uh, sort of looking toward the future or a possible job was just not in their horizon.
okay. So it's really just subsistence living is what you're talking
Oh,
about.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
And,
We have another
staying
question.
alive. I mean, they went staying alive because they went through long periods of starvation. In high school, even with, I mean, because of actually some of these reforms, plus a severe drought, they starved for 3 years. His whole class starved for 3 years, and the teachers. They ended up eating one or two steamed buns a day and some soup that was full of sticks and straw. So
That makes it hard, yes. We have another question. What was the name of the college that he attended?
oh, it was called the Xi'an Language Institute, and it's now, I believe, its formal name in English, which is not quite its name in Chinese, is Xi'an Foreign Languages University.
Oh, okay. And we have another question. Did you ever encounter any serious problems with communist authorities when you were there as a foreigner?
No, I've never had a problem. Um, I've always known people. No, I've never even thought about things. I mean, there's sometimes when someone grabbed a book from me once while I was on a train and looked at it, and it was actually a classic Chinese book, but it was a paperback I bought in the United States, and I thought, oh, I wonder what the cover is like, because some of the covers of paperbacks especially if they were inexpensive, have lewd pictures on the front of a woman with big bosoms or something. And I thought, I have no idea who this person was. He was a young man, and he grabbed this book and took it from me, and he looked at it and sort of paged through it for a while, and then he handed it back and left. And I never knew whether that was someone who was just not, just curious and didn't know how to act with a foreigner, because riding the trains, there were not a lot of foreigners, and or whether he was really someone looking for bad stuff. So, but that was sort of the worst thing I can remember. And I was probably somewhat. I know that I was when I went to shop and bargained. I know that my Chinese colleagues would very often intervene, not with people who were the Communist Party, but people who were anti-foreigners, who wanted to charge me as much as they possibly could, for instance.
Oh, well.
And I mean, that's the world over.
Yes. Especially if you're an American, everyone is rich in America.
Right. Yes, right.
When you travel. Is the book translated into Chinese, or will it be? Or did you have any trouble with the government over it?
We'll see. I mean, the government has changed in the last 3 years, and so things are much tighter. And in fact, I have all the papers to have it translated, which were developed and negotiated about 3 or 4 years ago. And whether or not it will be translated in this climate, this political climate, is hard to know. Anhui doesn't have a copy of the book yet because we can't figure out how to get it to him through customs, because no one's because he can't travel to China, and so sending it through by email just is not a wise thing. To send a big document at this time of any kind is just not smart to people, because the censors are hyperactive. And they're especially hyperactive right now because it's just about the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. And so things are very, very tense, I think, because the government's afraid they'll have demonstrations. So, I mean, that's my read on the situation.
Okay. Yes. Well, it must be hard, when regimes, are all pro-democracy one year and then drag everything back another.
Oh, yes, that's right. And of course, people like Anhui have lived through this. I mean, they're just learning. They know how to be quiet. Doesn't mean they agree. So.
Well, Anhui doesn't sound like he was quiet all the time.
Well, he wasn't. Nor were some other people. But in fact, he knows where not to push, I think is the word. So he knows where you can actually say things and where you shouldn't, because they learned that during the Cultural Revolution. Yeah,
but he was already in his 20s at that point. But what made Anhui, what traits does he have that are inborn that made him want to be who he became? And he was never satisfied just doing what his grandfather wanted him to do and continue doing his farm chores.
That's right. So he worked hard. I mean, he worked hard in the farm, and he learned to do all the things he needed to do, like plow, etc. But he was just from the beginning, I mean, that little snippet I read about the fact that when he had temper tantrums, no one could intervene at all. He was just determined, and I think he was probably a challenge for his parents, his mother was actually a peacemaker, because she had grown up the daughter of a widow, and widows were considered evil. And so she learned to sort of get along in various ways. And his father was a very soft-spoken person who probably had difficulty speaking. And so but he was obviously different from the rest of the family. And his younger brother, who's actually in the picture that's still up there, would say that Anwei was just different from the rest of them. So,
Okay, so this is just inborn traits.
yeah, right.
Yeah. Are you in touch with Anwei now by any means, or is it just not good to do that?
Well, right now, while they're getting ready for this anniversary, it's good not to do anything except say Happy New Year and the most bland types of things. So I do occasionally write something and I get the same kind of response back right now. And
Okay, so
it's just hard to know what is going to be like. I think one thing about his family that he talks about being very important as he went through this world of all the foreign affairs offices and these sort of very official places was that in fact one thing that offended people that he was so willing to work hard all the time. And other people said, well, why don't you just do Chinese chess or something? And he said, growing up as a farmer, you you don't say I'm going to do it, I'm going to plant the crops tomorrow. You plant them today because tomorrow may be too late. And so he just had that ethic, and it was certainly reinforced by his parents who were considered in the village very good people. So so that's another piece of his background.
okay, yeah, okay. Another question: how many siblings did he have altogether?
There were 7. I think I'm counting right. He was
Okay,
there was one girl, and then the rest were boys. And I'm not sure they all lived to adulthood. I mean, I've met 3, the sister plus 3 others. So
okay. This is a big question. I'm not sure we actually have time for this one. Can you comment on the opposing views of education, traditional Chinese of old highly valued education, and the communist and peasant views on education?
oh, just a minute. I can actually see it. Let me reread it. Uh, oh, I would say that they merge. Well, the peasant views of education has changed over time. So when Anwei's grandfather didn't want him to go to school, his father actually and parents wanted him to go to school and were very proud of him. So his grandfather was sort of an anachronism almost, or at least a representative of, of an older generation. So his parents really loved the idea of him going forward and were very proud of him. Um, so I think that whole thing about education has changed. And although education toward girls in the villages has been slower in coming because they feel as though if they have to invest funding, which it does cost, and they lose it because the girls marry out of the villages into another village or to another place. They go to the husband's
Yeah,
family. Yeah. And so they're all of their value, I mean, speaking very pragmatically, all of their value is lost. And so they don't like to invest a lot of money and time in the girls' education. That is changing gradually because China is changing dramatically, very quickly. And of course, a lot of the young people are going into the cities to work. Uh, the old value of education still exists, in in certainly in all of the urban areas, and to a greater extent in the rural areas and with the current generations. And so it turns out my book that compares Chinese and American education, and it's not about who's better and who's not. It's about strengths in both systems and weaknesses in both systems and how we could learn from each other. That book has actually been translated and published by actually a very large government publishing house. So it's a really interesting question that would be good to spend an evening having a conversation about, because of course there are bits and pieces of it, you know, but I think that old Confucian belief in education is so strong in China that in fact it has moved into the rural areas too, as the generations have gotten older and as communication has gotten better.
Okay. Because I just think about the old China, where, you know, you had these exams and the best of the best got to work in Beijing.
Right. That's right. Still true. Still true. It's very, I mean, it's what the young people and the parents say about their children, because I spent a lot of time spending, and this is mainly in the urban areas, talking with people about the demands of their children in education. And they just say, you know, they learn and they realize, a lot of parents, not all, but those with their own educations know that having to memorize everything from the time you're in first grade up through high school produces people who are fantastic at memorizing. But they said, how do you then become creative? How do you begin to think for yourself? And so there are just a lot of questions about the education, but the value of education, behaving in school, doing all your work. I mean, things that the school day in the classrooms, the teacher comes into the classroom and bang, that's the beginning of school. There's none of this extraneous stuff of passing out papers or, you know, making sure everyone's going to get their lunch ticket or whatever we go through, or phone calls from the office saying X, Y, and Z. Nothing. It's just pure teaching and student learning for a period of time. And the kids actually have done their homework, which isn't always true in the United States. So my notes at the beginning is, there is no time to misbehave in these classrooms. I mean, I've taught in both high school and elementary school in the United States. And so a little of that.
You don't always get it. Okay. Thank you so much, Nancy. This was very, very interesting. And I'm sure everyone learned so much. For you who are listening, Nancy Pine's book, One in a Billion, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey Through Modern Day China, is available from your favorite bookstore, or you may borrow it from Queens Public Library. Please join us next week when Donna Rifkin will be presenting The Sun and Her Stars, Saka Vital and Hitler's Exiles in the Golden Age of Hollywood.
Wow.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you again,
everybody.
Nancy.
Yes, yes.